The Pacific was quiet that morning, too quiet for March 1945, with the war burning hotter than ever. The ocean rolled in slow silver waves beneath a pale sky, the kind of calm that comes only before something terrible. The men aboard the USS Franklin had learned to read the sea, and even the greenest sailor felt that strange stillness that meant the world was holding its breath. She was a proud ship, the newest of the big Essex-class carriers, her deck smelling of fresh paint and salt. She had survived strikes against Luzon, Lingayen Gulf, Formosa, and the coast of Japan itself. The crew called her Big Ben. Her name meant strength, and for months she had lived up to it. Now she steamed barely 50 miles from Japan's coast, leading the task group that would hammer the home islands into surrender. The plan was simple. At dawn, she would launch her bombers for another strike against Honshu. The pilots had been briefed, the maps laid out, coordinates memorized. Inside the ready room, the men smoked in silence, faces half lit by the red battle lamps. Outside, the flight deck crews fueled and armed the planes, their boots echoing on steel planks still slick with morning dew. Avgas lines hissed. Bomb carts rattled. It was the routine rhythm of war at sea. At 6:58, the loudspeakers crackled. "General quarters! General quarters! All hands, man your battle stations." No one panicked. It was common this close to Japan. Somewhere beyond the clouds, a radar blip had appeared. A single contact. Maybe a scout plane. The ship's guns were already loaded, barrels glistening with oil. The smell of cordite lingered, faint but ready. The Franklin's air wing was halfway through warm-up. Hellcats and Avengers lined the deck nose to tail. Pilots ran to final checks. Mechanics waved chocks away. The sky was overcast but clear enough to fly. To any observer she looked invincible, a fortress of steel and motion, engines roaring in harmony. No one knew that within minutes, that harmony would turn to screams. At 7:05 the radar screens cleared. The single contact vanished into the clouds. The captain ordered the launch to continue. On the bridge, Commander Joe Taylor adjusted his binoculars, scanning the horizon. Nothing. Just low clouds and morning haze. Then he heard it, a faint buzz, high and fast from dead ahead. Out of the sun came a lone Japanese dive bomber, a D-4Y Judy. It dropped from the clouds so fast that gunners barely had time to aim. The first burst of anti-aircraft fire stitched harmlessly behind it. The Judy dove straight for the ship's heart, released 2 500-pound bombs, and vanished into the haze. The first bomb struck the flight deck near the center line, tearing through the planking and exploding deep in the hangar where armed aircraft waited. The second slammed into the deck near the after elevator, igniting rows of fuel tanks. The shock lifted the entire carrier, as if a giant hand had struck her from below. Men were thrown off their feet. Air became flame. Planes still armed and fueled went off like fireworks one after another, turning the hangar into an inferno. Within seconds, the Franklin's pristine decks became a landscape of twisted metal, burning fuel, and human chaos. The power went out. The ship listed. Smoke poured from every opening. In the galleries below, sailors crawled through fire searching for air. On the bridge, the captain wiped soot from his face and shouted for reports, but none came. All communication lines were dead. The world had narrowed to heat, noise, and instinct. Those who survived the first blast ran toward the flames. Damage control teams, many already burned, dragged hoses into the hangar deck, their rubber soles melting beneath them. They fought not to save themselves, but to keep the ship from exploding. Every plane carried bombs. Every bomb was seconds away from cooking off. The sound was a continuous thunder of secondary detonations, the ship groaning as if alive, protesting every hit. Up top, the flight deck crews tried to push undamaged aircraft overboard before they ignited. Some succeeded. Others vanished in blasts that left nothing but smoke. Men leapt into the sea rather than burn, their figures small against the boiling water. Gunners who stayed at their posts fired blindly into the sky, convinced more planes were coming. None were. The attack had lasted less than 60 seconds. The destruction would last all day. By 7:15, the Franklin was dead in the water, her engines silent, her deck split open like a wound. The ship that had looked unstoppable was now burning from bow to stern. Other vessels in the task group saw the rising column of smoke and steered toward her, unsure if they would arrive in time. The cruiser Santa Fe was first. Through binoculars, her captain could see men clinging to the rails, Waving for help through the fire, the Franklin looked finished. But somehow she stayed afloat. Her compartments were sealed tight, her bulkheads holding. Deep below the waterline, engineers still alive in the dark kept the pumps running by hand. They worked blind, choking on fumes, refusing to abandon the engines. Above them, the fires raged unchecked. The hangar became a furnace, ammunition cooking off in bursts that rocked the ship like aftershocks. At 8 o'clock, more than half the crew were dead or missing. Those who survived gathered at the edges of the flight deck, forming bucket lines of water because the hoses were burned through. Chaplains dragged bodies away from the flames. The medical bay was gone. Treatment took place on the open deck. Yet through all of it, the flag still hung from the mast, tattered but visible through the smoke. By 9 a.m, rescue destroyers circled her like vultures. The Santa Fe drew alongside, matching speed with the drifting carrier. Her crew began hauling survivors across on lines, pulling them hand over hand above the flames. Some men refused to leave, saying the ship could still be saved. Others clung to the ropes until their hands bled. Below decks, the magazines were heating. If the fire reached them, the ship would disappear in one final explosion. Damage control parties crawled through the smoke, searching for the flooding valves. They opened them manually, seawater pouring into compartments already half full of bodies. It was the only way to keep the bombs from detonating. The sea around the Franklin was carpeted with debris, fuel drums, shattered planes, rafts, and the bodies of men who had jumped too late. The sun rose higher, turning the smoke column gold. Every ship in sight could see her burning, yet she refused to sink. At 10 o'clock, the captain regained partial communication with the engine room. The message came through in static. "Engine still operable. We can give you power." No one believed it at first. Then deep below, the turbines groaned, coughed, and began to turn. Faint vibrations moved through the deck. The ship shuddered but held. It was impossible, and yet it was happening. A carrier struck dead center by 2 bombs, gutted by fire, still alive. The men who could still move looked at each other and felt something strange rise inside them. Not joy, not hope exactly, but defiance. The same stubborn will that had carried them through the long Pacific War. The same will that said, "Not today." All afternoon the Franklin burned. The sun dipped behind a haze of smoke, turning the horizon orange. The ocean reflected the fire like a mirror. Nearby ships kept watch, expecting at any moment for her to roll and vanish. She never did. At sunset she was still there, scarred, silent, but floating. When darkness fell, the fires had finally burned themselves out. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of oil and ash across the sea. The Franklin lay dead in the water, half her crew gone, decks littered with twisted planes and blackened steel. Yet her hull remained solid, her heart still beating deep below. The radio crackled once more. From the engine room came the words that would pass into legend. "We can make way under our own power." The bridge crew stared at each other in disbelief. The captain nodded once. "Then let's take her home." And so the ship that should have died began to move, slowly, painfully, one knot at a time, away from the coast of Japan, carrying the ghosts of her fallen toward the horizon. Behind her the ocean closed, swallowing the wreckage. Ahead lay thousands of miles of sea and the long, impossible journey back to life. Night fell hard on the Franklin. The fires had burned for more than 12 hours before the last one died, leaving the carrier in silence, broken only by the groan of steel cooling in the dark. Smoke still poured from the elevator shafts and gun sponsons. The ocean around her shimmered with drifting fuel oil that caught the moonlight like liquid glass. Every man still standing knew they had witnessed something that should have been impossible. On the bridge, Captain Gare stood at the shattered windows, face blackened with soot, staring east toward the faint glow of Japan. He said little. The few officers left near him worked quietly, plotting a course back toward the fleet anchorage at Ulithi. They had no radar, no radios, no lights. The Franklin would make her retreat in darkness, a ghost slipping through enemy waters. Below decks, the damage was worse than anyone could imagine. Hangar deck bulkheads were melted through. Hundreds of bodies lay where they had fallen. Rescue parties moved through the wreckage with flashlights wrapped in red cloth, calling softly, afraid of what they would find. The heat had twisted everything, guns, ladders, even the steel of the deck itself. Water dripped from burst pipes, hissing on the still-hot metal. The smell of oil, smoke, and burned paint clung to everything. By midnight, the Santa Fe was still alongside, her own decks crowded with survivors. Lines stretched between the two ships, sagging with the weight of wounded men being hauled across. Each time a swell rolled between them, the ropes went taut, creaking like the bones of giants. Sailors whispered prayers as they crossed, clutching whatever hand or harness they could reach. Some fell into the water and were gone before anyone could react. On both vessels, chaplains worked without pause. They moved from man to man, giving last rites, washing soot from faces so families could recognize them later. No one kept count anymore. They had lost too many for numbers to matter. At 0200, the engineers coaxed more power from the surviving turbines. The carrier began to crawl south at 4 knots. Men cheered weakly as they felt the vibration through the deck plates, proof that she still lived. The Santa Fe took up escort position close on her starboard quarter. Their light stayed dark. Only the dim outline of her hull could be seen against the phosphorescent sea. Somewhere beyond the horizon lay Japan's coast and airfields packed with kamikazes. If they found the Franklin again, there would be no second miracle. Dawn came grey and windless, hung over the ocean like a pall. The full scale of the damage could finally be seen. The flight deck was cratered, the island shredded. Planes lay crushed and burned, their wings folded over one another like dead birds. Hundreds of holes from shrapnel and bomb fragments covered every surface, and yet, through it all, the ship still floated on an even keel. Messages finally reached the task force. Franklin operational under own power, heavy casualties. The rest of the fleet could hardly believe it. From the air she looked like a wreck, a black scar drifting through the silver sea. But inside her hull, life persisted. Men slept where they stood, hands blistered, eyes red from smoke. Others simply sat staring at the ocean, too tired to speak. That afternoon, the crew held a brief burial service. The wind carried the chaplain's voice across the deck as bodies wrapped in canvas slid into the sea. There were so many that the ceremony blurred together, names lost, prayers shortened to whispers. When it was over, no one moved for a long time. The ocean swallowed its silence. By evening, destroyers arrived to guard the crippled carrier. They formed a ring around her, guns ready, scanning for submarines. On the Franklin, the pumps worked non-stop. Water sloshed knee-deep through compartments, but she stayed level. Engineers reinforced bulkheads with wooden beams, anything to keep the pressure steady. The ship's doctors worked in what remained of the wardroom, turning dinner tables into operating stations. Their instruments were black with soot. They boiled them in coffee pots for lack of anything else. 2 days passed. Each sunrise felt like a victory. The closer they came to the safety of the fleet, the stronger the Franklin seemed to grow. Smoke faded to a thin grey ribbon. The flag still flew, ragged but whole. Every mile earned under her own power felt like defiance against the ocean itself. On the 3rd day they sighted other carriers. Hancock, Bennington, Bunker Hill. Sleek and untouched. Crews lined their rails in silent salute as the Franklin passed. No one spoke over the radios. The sight said enough. The wounded ship and the men who refused to abandon her. Inside, teams continued clearing the lower decks. Each hour brought new discoveries. Munitions that hadn't exploded, fuel tanks leaking through cracked seams, bodies sealed behind bulkheads. They worked methodically, always aware that one spark could undo everything they had saved. When the explosions did come, small and scattered, no one flinched anymore. They just kept working. Captain Guerras refused to leave the bridge. He slept in his chair, waking only to issue orders or scrawl notes in the logbook. His handwriting wavered but stayed legible. Ship proceeding under own power. Crew exhausted but steady. Later readers would say it sounded emotionless, but those who were there knew better. The captain's calm was the only thing holding what remained of the crew together. On March 24th, 5 days after the attack, the Franklin reached Ulithi Atoll. The lagoon was crowded with ships, destroyers, transports, oilers, but every eye turned as the Blackened carrier entered. Her paint was blistered, her deck skeletal, her island leaning slightly to one side. Tugs moved alongside to guide her in. Over the loudspeakers, a single announcement echoed across the anchorage. USS Franklin arriving under her own power. The fleet responded with horns and whistles, a chorus of disbelief and respect. Even battle-hardened sailors wept openly. The Franklin's crew lined her railings as best they could, staring out at the sea of ships and men saluting. Some smiled, others just stood silent, knowing they had brought home something far greater than steel. Repairs began immediately, but there was little to work with. Whole sections of the ship had to be cut away. Electricians rigged temporary lines, welders patched holes with whatever plate they could find. The Franklin's scars were beyond disguise. She looked more like a skeleton than a ship. Yet she still floated, steady and proud. Within a week she was ready to steam again, solely under escort, back to Pearl Harbor, then to the mainland. When she departed Ulithi, her sister ships formed a loose procession behind her. Sailors lined the decks again, hats held to their chests. The sun set behind them, and the Franklin disappeared into the glare, leaving only the dark column of her smoke trailing westward. The voyage home was long and quiet. For many aboard, it was the first time they'd slept without the sound of alarms. The fires were gone, but the memories stayed sharp. At night, the horizon flickered with lightning that looked too much like explosions. Men woke sweating, sure they'd heard the whine of a dive bomber again. Some refused to go below deck at all, sleeping instead beneath the stars near lifeboats and ropes. When the Franklin finally entered Pearl Harbor, word spread fast. Every tug, every small boat, every ship in port came out to greet her. Pilots flew overhead in slow formation, dipping their wings. On the pier, bands played, but their music faded against the sight of what remained of the carrier. Her once clean decks were black with soot. The island was a twisted ruin. Holes big enough to drive trucks through scarred her flight deck. Yet her flag was still flying and her engines still turning. Reporters called her the ship that refused to die. The phrase stuck. Newspapers ran photos of her smoking silhouette under headlines that simply read unsinkable. Across America, families who had never heard of her name before now spoke it with reverence. The Franklin became a symbol of the war itself, bloody, battered, but unbroken. For the men who had lived through it, the return home was harder. They stepped off the gangway into sunlight that felt unreal. The noise of the city made them flinch. The smell of fresh air made them dizzy. Many never spoke of that day again. Others carried pieces of the ship with them. Chips of metal, scraps of flag, photographs scorched at the edges. To them, those fragments were proof that they had faced the abyss and come back. The Franklin herself was repaired enough to steam to the Brooklyn Navy Yard, but she would never fight again. Her decks were rebuilt for transport duty, her guns stripped, her scars hidden under new paint. Still, everyone who saw her knew. Beneath the fresh steel was the memory of fire and the voices of 800 dead. When the war ended later that year, celebrations roared across the nation. But on the Franklin, the mood was quieter. She lay moored in calm water, her hull reflecting fireworks from the shore. A few sailors gathered on the flight deck with coffee instead of champagne. One of them set down a small radio playing the news of Japan's surrender. No one cheered. They simply watched the lights and let the sound of peace wash over them. The oldest petty officer broke the silence. "She's done her duty," he said softly. "Now she can rest." The others nodded. For the first time in months, the sea around the Franklin was still. Time passed, but the Franklin story refused to fade. In the months after Japan's surrender, she remained tied to her pier at the Brooklyn Navy Yard, quiet, battered, and strangely dignified among the rows of clean, freshly painted ships returning from victory parades. Her decks, though patched and replanked, still carried the ghosts of that terrible morning. Each scar in the steel was a name, each dent a memory. Visitors who came aboard could feel it. They said the ship seemed to hum faintly when you touched her bulkhead, a vibration that wasn't from any engine or generator but from something deeper, the echo of all the men who had fought to keep her alive. Sailors from newer carriers walked her decks in silence like pilgrims at a shrine. To them she was not a wreck, but a symbol of survival itself. The Navy studied her carefully. Engineers examined every plate, every weld, trying to understand how she had stayed afloat. The conclusions were technical and watertight compartments, sound design, quick response. But everyone who had been there knew the truth was simpler. It was the men. They had refused to let her die. For the survivors, peace was a different kind of battle. Many went home to small towns scattered across America. They were greeted as heroes, but few felt like ones. They had seen too much. Nights were restless, filled with the smell of smoke that wasn't there. Some woke to the sound of the imagined alarms. Others never boarded another ship again. Yet whenever they met, at reunions, bars, or small church halls, they spoke of the Franklin the same way one might speak of a living person. She fought, she bled, she never gave up. By 1946, the Navy began to downsize. Carriers that had once ruled the Pacific were decommissioned, mothballed, or scrapped. The Franklin's name appeared on that list. Her engines, silent since her arrival in New York, would never turn again. Orders came down to remove her weapons, her electronics, and everything of value. The ship that had survived the worst inferno of the war would be stripped piece by piece, slowly, clinically, like the dismantling of a monument. When the workers came, they found traces of the battle still hidden in her. Melted tools fused to deck plates, bullets embedded in bulkheads, the outlines of hands where men had pressed against steel while crawling through smoke. Some of the workmen paused, uncertain whether they should touch such things. One foreman, a veteran himself, told his crew quietly, "Handle her with respect. She's done more than any of us ever will." Parts of the Franklin were sent to museums, others to scrap yards. Her bell went to a chapel in Indiana. A section of her deck, still scorched, was preserved at the National Naval Aviation Museum, but most of her simply vanished, melted down into the anonymous steel of a post-war world. And yet her name lingered, not as a relic, but as an idea. Whenever sailors told stories of endurance, the Franklin returned. She became shorthand for courage under fire, for the refusal to sink when logic said it was over. The Navy's next generation learned her tale at training academies. The carrier that burned died and kept fighting anyway. In 1950, when the Korean War erupted, many of her survivors were called back to service. Some found themselves on new carriers, larger, faster, gleaming with the promise of a new era. Yet standing on those spotless decks, they felt something missing. The hum, the grit, the sense that survival itself was the mission. They spoke of it to younger sailors who couldn't quite understand. The old men would smile and say, "You should have seen the Franklin. Then you'd know what a ship can take." One such sailor, decades later, would write in his journal, "We thought she was gone when the bombs hit, but she stayed, and so did we. Maybe that's why I'm still here. The Franklin didn't die, and neither did we." His words would be read at a reunion half a century later, when only a handful of them remained. They passed the note around like scripture. The ship's legacy spread beyond the Navy. Historians, authors, and filmmakers tried to capture what had happened that day. In March 1945, they wrote about the engineering, the heroism, the tragedy, but none of them could quite explain the feeling aboard, the heat, the choking smoke, the impossible will to keep going when there was no reason left to believe. Only those who had seen it could understand. One journalist described her best. She was more than steel and men. She was an act of defiance made real. And that, more than anything, is what the Franklin became. Defiance. Against the enemy, against the sea, against fate itself, she proved that survival could be victory, that sometimes endurance was the greatest act of war. In the decades that followed, reunions became smaller. The men grew old, their hair white, their memories softer at the edges, but whenever they gathered, the stories came alive again. They could still smell the smoke, hear the roar of explosions echoing through the hull, feel the deck trembling under their boots. They would laugh about how young they were. "Just kids," one would say, shaking his head. Then their eyes would darken as they remembered those who never came home. At one reunion in 1985, held aboard the museum ship Intrepid in New York, a small group of Franklin veterans stood on the deck as the sun set behind the Hudson River. One of them, now in his 60s, leaned on the rail and whispered, "She was tougher than any of us." Another replied, "No. She was us." They stood there in silence for a long time. When they left, they saluted the river, as if saluting the ocean itself. By the dawn of the 21st century, few remained. Their children and grandchildren carried their stories forward, collecting letters, photos, and medals. Some built websites, others documentaries. The tale of the Franklin continued to find new audiences. Students, historians, and historians, people who had never known war but still felt its echo in those black and white photographs of a burning ship refusing to die. One photo in particular became iconic. Taken from the cruiser Santa Fe, it showed the Franklin engulfed in fire, her entire midsection a storm of smoke and flame, yet still upright, still afloat. In that image was everything, all thing. Destruction and survival, horror and hope. It hung in naval academies, classrooms and museums, a reminder of what humans are capable of when the world collapses around them. Today, the Franklin's name lives quietly among the legends of the sea. There are no parades, no great monuments, just a memory that refuses to fade. But every sailor who's ever walked a carrier's deck knows her story. It's told in mess halls and training rooms, often beginning with disbelief and ending in reverence. You ever hear about the Franklin? Someone will ask, and that room will fall silent. They all know what comes next. They'll hear about the bombs, the fire, the inferno that should have sent her to the bottom. They'll hear about the men who stayed, who crawled through the smoke to keep the pumps running, who refused to jump ship even as the deck melted beneath them. And then they'll hear the ending, the words that defied history. We can make way under our own power. Those words have outlived the ship itself. They've become a part of naval tradition, passed from generation to generation. Because in the end, that's what the Franklin was, proof that no matter how fierce the storm, no matter how heavy the losses, a crew's spirit can carry steel farther than any engine ever could. Somewhere in a quiet corner of a museum, a small brass plaque bears her name. USS Franklin, CV-13, the ship that refused to die. Visitors walk past without realizing what it means, without hearing the echoes of the guns or the crackle of flames. But for those who stop, for those who run their fingers across the engraved letters, something stirs, a faint hum, a whisper from the past. It says what every survivor already knows. She's still out there, somewhere, beneath the endless grey of the Pacific, sailing on in memory. Decades later, when the world had moved on from war and the Pacific had turned peaceful again, the story of the Franklin remained like a ripple in calm water. Faint, but never truly gone. She was gone in steel, but not in soul. The last of her crewmen grew old, their hair thinned, their steps slowed. But when they spoke of her, something of their youth returned. The spark in the eyes, the set of the jaw, the look of men who had seen hell and walked back out of it. In nursing homes, in small-town porches, in veterans' halls with fading photographs on the walls, they told the same story over and over, not to boast, but to remember. We weren't heroes, they'd say. We were just trying to keep her alive. And then, after a pause, but she sure was something, wasn't she? The children and grandchildren who listened often didn't understand the scale of it, how one ship could mean so much. But they saw the tears, heard the tremor in the voices, and realized that the Franklin wasn't just a vessel. She was a chapter of their family's history, a living testament to what courage looks like when everything else is gone. In archives and libraries, her logbooks were preserved. They're simple, spare, the handwriting steady even when the world was on fire. 0708, hit by bombs, fires out of control. 0915, ship holding, attempting to regain power. 1740, fires contained. 2215, underway. No superlatives, no emotion. Just the record of survival written in navy ink. But between those lines lies the heartbeat of something immortal, the refusal to yield. Historians studying the Pacific War often compare the Franklin to myth. They call her the Phoenix Carrier, a ship reborn from her own ashes. They analyse the engineering, the tactics, the leadership, trying to quantify what saved her. Yet none of those explanations feel adequate, because there are some things that can't be measured in tons or degrees or damage control reports. The Franklin survived because she was carried by belief, the unspoken pact among her men that she would not die while one of them could still move, breathe, or fight. In the 1970s, a naval historian asked one of her surviving engineers, now an old man with shaking hands, how they kept going after the second bomb. The old sailor smiled faintly and said, "You don't think. You just do. You hold a wrench, you turn a valve, and you tell yourself she's not going down today, not while you're still breathing." He paused, then added, "And she didn't." That's how the Franklin endured. Through thousands of small, unrecorded acts of defiance, a man carrying another through the smoke, a gunner refusing to leave his station though his hands were burned raw, a mechanic sealing a hatch knowing it meant he wouldn't get out. These were the threads that wove together to hold her up. Steel didn't save her, people did. When the last Franklin reunion took place in the early 2000s, only a few dozen men remained. They gathered in a hotel ballroom near Norfolk, their tables draped in white cloth, the air filled with laughter and silence in equal measure. Some brought photographs, others fragments of the ship. On a small stage stood a model of the Franklin, her decks immaculate, her flag forever flying. During the closing ceremony, a bell tolled 8 times, once for each 100 men lost that morning in 1945. When the last tone faded, no one spoke. They simply stood and saluted the empty space where she would have been. A few wiped their eyes. The oldest among them whispered, "She's still out there." That night, as they left, they passed a display set up in the hallway, a single photograph taken from the Santa Fe, showing the Franklin wreathed in flame. The caption beneath read, USS Franklin CV-13, the ship that refused to die. They stopped and looked at it for a long time. One man touched the glass with trembling fingers and said, almost to himself, "We thought that was the end." But it wasn't, was it? His friend shook his head. "No," he said softly. "She just kept going." The Pacific today is calm. Cargo ships move where fleets once clashed. The waves that once reflected fire now glint with sunlight. And yet, if you stand on the deck of a modern carrier in those same waters, somewhere between Okinawa and the Japanese mainland, and close your eyes, you might hear something faint beneath the wind. The hum of engines that aren't there, the clang of tools, the heartbeat of a ship that refused to die. Sailors sometimes say that old ships never truly leave the sea. Their names echo through the waves, carried from one generation to the next. The Franklin's name is one of those echoes. Every new crew that launches from an American carrier inherits a piece of her. The stubbornness, the endurance, the refusal to yield no matter how bad it gets. It's part of the DNA of every sailor who's ever stood watch at night and looked out over a black horizon. And maybe that's how the legends live on, not as grand monuments or statues, but as whispers carried forward in the hearts of those who come after, and the Franklin is that whisper. A reminder that survival isn't luck, it's choice, it's will. It's the quiet voice inside that says not today and means it. So when the storms come, and the alarms sound, and the decks tremble beneath the weight of the sea, somewhere deep in the steel and smoke that same voice still speaks, the one born in March of 1945, when a carrier lay burning 50 miles off Japan and somehow refused to sink. It says, "We can make way under our own power." That sentence, plain, unpoetic, almost mechanical, became one of the most powerful in naval history, because behind it lies everything that defines courage: pain endured, fear mastered, and hope that refuses to die. Today nothing remains of the Franklin but scattered pieces and photographs, but her story continues to ripple across time. It lives in every history book, every museum plaque, every black and white image of smoke curling into the sky. And more than that, it lives in the idea that when everything burns, you can still move forward. They called her Big Ben. They called her the ship that refused to die. And they were both right, because though her hull lies gone, her name sails on the surface of memory, steady, proud, and eternal. She is still moving, still holding her course, still alive. Somewhere out there, beneath the grey Pacific dawn, the echo of her engine still hums. And if you listen long enough, you can hear it say, "We can make way under our own power."